Did you know that France has had 17 or to 19 kings called Louis? Don't ask why the number is variable, it's a long story. That's a lot of Louis, and it can be a little difficult to remember which is which, but thankfully there's the practice of regnal numbers, giving each king an associated number to help keep track of things. So the first is Louis the First, and the last is Louis the 18th or Louis the 19th. Don't worry about there being two last ones, it's a long story. The practice of numbering monarchs first showed up in the 13th century, but didn't really become the norm until the Middle Ages were more or less over, which is why coins from the three English kings called Richard simply say Ricardus Rex, without any numbers. But regnal numbers have been retroactively applied to rulers as a historical convenience, so I can just say Richard III instead of that one in the parking lot. Most royal lines have used regnal numbers, though Japan has a similar but different system, and many countries have their own little quirks with it, such as England having 11 Edwards but only numbering 8 of them, or how Spain continues counting kings from the kingdoms before Spain even existed. But the strangest and most confusing implementation of it comes from Sweden. The current king of Sweden is Karl XVI Gustaf. Naturally, you'd assume that means there were 15 Karls before him, the first being Karl Sverkersson between 1161 and 1167, who is traditionally known as Karl VII. Wait a second, if he's the first King Karl, why is he called the 7th? What happened to the first 6? The answer's simple, they don't exist. Karl isn't the only Swedish royal name to be mistakenly increased. The name Eric, too, supposedly has 6 kings before Eric the Victorious, who is considered the first king of Sweden today. So where did these phantom kings come from, and how did they end up giving us Karl XVI instead of Karl X? The answer lies with a man named Johan Munson, a Swedish bishop and historian whose magnum opus is his Historia de omnibus Gotorum Svenonumque Regibus, or History of All the Kings of the Goths and Swedes, published posthumously by his brother Olaus in 1554. This massive manuscript claims to trace the genealogy of Swedish monarchs from the earliest times to the present, but takes some creative liberties with the narrative. And by creative liberties, I mean it's completely insane. While most people would name Eric the Victorious as Sweden's first king, with his reign beginning around 970, Munson names the first king of Sweden as Magog, son of Japheth from the book of Genesis, reigning in 2216 BC. Geoffrey of Monmouth's half-legendary list of British rulers has nothing on Munson. 16 entire volumes of Munson's Historia are dedicated to 109 imaginary kings, mixing biblical figures, Viking legend, and stuff we assume he just made up for no reason. He also suggests that the Danes are descended from people exiled from Sweden for being degenerate criminals, which, considering the rivalry between the two countries, is kind of funny. So how did this comical bastardization of biblical and Norse lore end up influencing the actual official regnal numbers of Sweden? Though part of the reason Munson wrote the book was to spite King Gustav Vasa for being a Protestant, he coincidentally makes up several tyrannical rulers, all named something similar to Gustav. When the book was finally printed by Olaus, he had it dedicated to Gustav's sons, Eric, Johann, Magnus, and Karl, who apparently, missing the subtext of demonization of their dear old dad, liked its shameless Dane bashing and extolling Swedish glory, and presumably having not read enough to realize how crazy it is, which is understandable considering it's massive. When Gustav's eldest son Eric took the throne in 1560, he took on the numeral the 14th, despite being only the 7th Eric based on Munson's chronology. And when Eric's grandson Johann III was deposed, although he would continue to rule as King of Poland, and Karl, the youngest son of Gustav Vasa, became king, he took the name Karl IX, despite only being the 3rd. Nowadays, of course, no one believes Munson's king list, and Eric the Victorious is acknowledged as the first Swedish king by everyone today, including the current king. So this all begs the question, if everyone agrees that the regnal numbers are wrong, why was it never changed? It's just never really been a pressing issue for the Swedes. They know that Karl the 16th isn't really the 16th, but it's not really a big deal for them. The inflated numbers are only used from when Gustav Vasa's sons started using them. All the previous ones are referred to by epithets, which was actually the standard in medieval times. So instead of the accurate Eric VI or the inaccurate Eric XI, Swedes referred to the man who reigned from 1222 to 1229 and 1234 to 1250 as Eric the Stuttering and Club-Footed, which is also a contender for the most insulting nickname ever. It's easy to just subtract 6 from a king's regnal number to find out their actual order anyways, so whether you're a historian compiling your own Historia Omnibus, or someone who's just curious to learn a little about Sweden, getting the right number isn't much of a hassle. Now, the regnal numbers of the papacy is a whole other matter, with a non-existent pope showing up in the middle of a set of 22 real popes with the same name, and how technically every single pope named Stephen has 2 numbers. But that's a story for another day.